Hey everyone. In this session, we're going to get a reality check on those data lakes that you've been using in your enterprise to try to make sense of your data. We want to take your data lakes as something that's just for storage and turn it into something that's strategic. Really excited about that. My name is Rob Whelan. I'm the practice director for our data and analytics practice at Second Watch. I've got a background in submarines, of all things, and changed careers to get into data and analytics, and I've been consulting for a number of years with premier consulting partners. Very excited to be joined by Chris Garvey. Chris?
Hey everybody, I'm Chris Garvey. I'm our EVP of product here at Second Watch. And similar to Rob, I spent a better part of my career focused on building, maintaining data lakes or early versions of data lakes, right, when they were data warehouses, and helping moving them to the cloud.
So let's take a look at those science projects. How many of you have heard this before? Hey, we're going to centralize all our data into a single data lake so that we can make better, more informed decisions. Everyone's going to have access to it, and we're going to be bulletproof when it comes to analysis. Well, how is that working out for you? About a year in, 6 months in, we've just got so much data and we still don't know how to use it. We've got a data lake there. It's hard to use, hard to access. No one knows what we have. We don't trust it. Does this sound familiar? Well, if it does, then do we have an agenda for you? This is what we're going to do. Data lake science projects that we've seen, we'll give you a few examples. We'll tell you a couple nuggets on how to fix them, and then give you a roadmap on how to go from a data lake that's primarily just for storage to something that's a strategic asset in your business. So let's start with data lake science projects that we have seen. How do you know that you've got a science project on your hands? Well, one of the key indicators is that it's only adopted by little pockets of the company here and there. Not everyone's using it. Or it's so secure that no one can really access the data. They're not sure how to ask about it. Those two are kind of the big ones that I've seen. But Chris, what have you seen?
You know, I think the biggest indicator of whether you might have a science project in your hand is when things have gone quiet, right? You've spent a lot of time building a structure or starting out with an initial project, but yet you're not getting any feedback. You're not hearing either good feedback, bad feedback. That was kind of always my indicator when I was building similar structures before, that we might be off on a science project. That type of feedback that you get is usually an indicator that it's being used and that you have some things to improve on.
No news is bad news when it comes to data lakes. If nothing's happening, it's sort of we're back to using our gut to make decisions, and I think that's something unique about data projects that we feel like we can kind of live without it, but we think otherwise. So here are some big patterns that we've seen uh, that are indicators that could lead to some of the issues that we showed before. You might have basically a legacy data warehouse, but it's in the cloud. You're basically running a data warehouse in a different data center than before. You've lifted and shifted your warehouse. You're running on maybe EC2 and only using EC2 and nothing else. You're just not getting the agility that you thought you would get from the cloud. So, Chris, how does this happen?
Yeah, I like to refer to this as kind of the change of scenery approach, where you take something that you might have built on premise and you're going to move it into the cloud. You know, the assumption is that you're going to move it without maybe having much disruption on your end users, and that might be a path of least resistance. But the reality is, any type of change, you know, whether you're moving it to moving it as is going to cause some type of disruption. And you might get a little bit of savings, but the reality is you're not going to end up realizing that full value that the cloud can bring in changing that structure. So I would certainly shy away from this, you know, just the change of scenery type approach.
Mm. Yeah, I think the opportunity here is well, it's there's many more best practices that maybe you're not taking advantage of. So Lift and shift, legacy data warehouse, but in the cloud. Um, how about this non-standard built from scratch design? This could be maybe on the opposite end of the spectrum. Uh, your team has maybe read some articles or gotten uh, some tips or feedback from outside consultants, and you're kind of building from scratch something that makes sense to you. You have this if you just feel like there's too much custom implementation. You're spending a lot of time on maintenance and maybe exotic workflows. If it just seems like it's way too much work to process a report or to get something out of the system, uh, that would be an indicator that you've kind of built it from scratch. Uh, the theme here that we're going to see a lot in this session is that this is suffering from a lack of focus on the business value in the first place. Um, and then, of course, the special case where you've made a data lake and all it does is store data. So you're this is interesting because in some ways you're partially succeeding. The point of a data lake and cloud storage is that it's inexpensive to store data, and you shouldn't have to make a bunch of decisions around the value of the data or the format before you store it. What's missing though here is that you don't have a champion to drive results, and people aren't really getting stuff out of it that they need. Anything else on that, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, this was kind of the common refrain, right? We have so much data, we don't know what to do with it. So we want to create this massive data store, and then maybe figure out what to do with it later, right? We know we have creative analysts; they'll know what to do with it. They'll get something out of it. It was kind of the proverbial, build it and they will come. Um, and it might be a less expensive endeavor than it used to be. Storage is cheaper, right? Compute's cheaper, but you're not really taking advantage of all of the true usability and the elasticity, the growth, and the flexibility that something in the cloud can offer you, nor are you taking advantage of the native services and all the advances that are happening within cloud native data related services that are out there today.
Yeah, and that last point is really good, Chris, because uh, our solution to all this is you really need to be taking advantage of the elasticity in the cloud native services because it's so cheap and easy to use. Um, so how do you fix that science project? We've got a few nuggets for you, and the first one is you should probably just blow it up. We're being kind of funny here, but it might be best simply to start over because the cost of experimentation in the cloud is so cheap. Um, it's not uncommon for people to build out a data lake, make some decisions that it wasn't going the way they needed to, and you just start over. It's not that um, it's not that bad if that's what happens. Um, okay, so two maybe more focused recommendations for you. Our first recommendation is you should get clear about the purpose of your data lake. What are you using it for? Are you trying to reduce costs? Are you trying to increase revenue, reduce risk? Are there specific reports or metrics that some business unit really needs? And what happens if it were to turn off completely? Um, Chris, anything to add on this clarity aspect?
Yeah, this one is always the one what I would refer to as if something breaks or it turns off, does anyone care? Right? So you need to be really, really crisp on how's this being used for your business. If something goes bump in the night or you end up having an issue, is anybody going to notice? If the answer to that is no, then you probably have a science project and you might not be clear on how this structure is being used and how it's being important to your business. Also, operationally, once this starts running, those are your most important customers. Those are the people that you really want to stay focused on to make sure that you have that tight business linkage and that it's being ultimately used in the right ways.
It's it's not uncommon for engineers or the IT department to maybe not have as much insight as they would like as to how the data is used. So sometimes they don't know the answer to that question. If this thing were to shut off, who would care? Um, I had a conversation with a customer where we were trying to refactor how data was getting ingested into their data lake. They had S3 and Redshift, and there was a fair amount of data coming in, and it was just a complicated schema. And I asked, well, look, if you just didn't have to bring in the schema whatsoever, would that be a problem? And they said, oh yeah, the whole system would lose its purpose. So it doesn't always, uh, basically, if you don't know what it's being used for, it's worth your time to ask around and try to find out. Now that you know how to get clear and the business purpose for your data lake, it's time to architect for simplicity. And our recommendation here is to make the most of cloud native services. And I'll talk you through this architecture diagram and we'll get into it a bit. From left to right, you have your data sources, and then you have ingestion with Amazon Kinesis, for example. And once it's in, there has to be some ETL, some processing to make it available for analytics. And then finally, you need to provision that data for use. And the 3 green buckets are just S3 buckets. We almost always recommend a 3-zone data lake. The first zone we call the drop zone. This is your single source of truth. This is where you just store everything. If you ever need to replay anything from your data ingestion, you've got it right there in the drop zone. Then you make a copy of it and reformat it for analytics in the analytics zone. It's a completely separate bucket. And in the analytics zone, your data should be formatted in some accessible format that's optimized for analysis, like Parquet. Parquet is a columnar data format, and it should be compressed. From there, you can use something like Amazon Athena for ad hoc analysis. And finally, once you find something that you like and is valuable to your business, you make another copy of it and put it in the curated zone. These are your data marts or your golden data sets. This is a 3-zone data lake. Wrapped around it is our controls for data governance. You should know what you have in it, and you should also be controlling access, for example. But really, this is it. When we work with customers, we really want to get them into this second zone as fast as possible. So that's where you start getting the aha moments. And I've not been part of a consulting project where there hasn't been an aha moment. And that's where you want to get people into that analytics zone. All right, so we've gotten clear, we know our business case, and we're architecting for those needs. Hopefully you're past the point of just pure storage, but how do you make it something that has great strategic value? We have 4 steps for you to go from your storage-focused data lake or a science project into a strategic asset. The first principle is to begin with the end users in mind. And this is where you kind of put on your product manager hat. Your end users are the folks who are consuming data. And so here on the left, you have your data lake, which we just showed a couple slides ago. And in the middle are the consumers of the data. Just picture this as the curated zone. Redshift is your petabyte scale data warehouse that's scalable. RDS, believe it or not, is not a bad option for smaller data sets and analysis. And of course, SageMaker for machine learning workloads. I think Amazon QuickSight is a great place to end up because no data project is done until you can see and feel the data. So we're beginning with the uh, end state in mind. But Chris, does this feel a little bit too simple to you? Is that a problem?
I've never really seen that as a problem when you start with something that's a little more simplistic, right? I think you have to think back to some of the lessons that we learned in traditional data warehouses that we built, 15, 20, 25 years ago, and then kind of iterated on over the last couple of years. And I think some of the mistakes that we've made have actually tried to recreate some of those principles, right, in the new modern data lakes, both that you might have had on-prem or you have today, or that you're trying to create in the cloud. And simplicity matters. It really, um, if you're trying to create something that's overly complex, right, which might look like what you had before, you're going to run into the same problems we had before, right, which are that the data structure was overly complex, it was brittle, it was difficult to maintain, it didn't scale well. And so I think starting with a more simplistic structure, right, a set of core services as Rob's laid out on this particular diagram, which and really are the best practices to start with in AWS, you have a nice foundation to build from with all the features and flexibility that you need, but you're not introducing too much complexity there at the start. And over time, you certainly can bring in more, but you're staying focused on the business value versus a giant science project, which is what we're all afraid of.
Yeah, we're definitely fans of business business case first and technology second, and you've got that option to pursue that path in AWS. Okay, so you've begun with the end in mind. Um, how about getting an executive champion? So this is an interesting stat. The Harvard Business Review put out an article in 2019 investigating why data projects and enterprises fail. Turns out that 70% of data projects fail due to the lack of an executive champion. And this is not just hey, my manager is kind of interested in this one report. This is someone kind of at the VP level or C level who says data is important. We cannot live without it. We cannot be going by our gut for this. So um, you want to hear culturally people saying, "Hey, do you have data to support that?" Um, so, Chris, talk about the importance of evangelizing these wins and sort of how would you convince an executive, you being an executive yourself, to adopt some kind of a data program?
Yeah, I mean, I think the importance of this can't be understated. In the past, when I've built out large structures that they all started small, and we built incrementally over time, and finding that stakeholder internally within the organization is really critical when you need to go to bat to get more resources to uh, you know if something breaks and you need a little bit of air cover because nothing's ever perfect when you first put it into production, or you need to make some changes on the fly. You need somebody that's gonna have your back really around from an air cover standpoint, as well as going to bat for additional resources whenever these types of projects come in play. Additionally, when you go on a bit of a PR campaign internally, you need somebody who can draw back to those real business outcomes to point to the fact that, hey, look, this data structure, this system that we've built is actually helping improve our business. And depending on where you are in that organization, you might be very in tune with some of those business metrics, the rhythms of the business. But ideally, you would have that stakeholder who is on the business side, who is focused on those metrics and the rhythm of the business, and who can draw a parallel to you for you and your team.
Yeah, yeah. This kind of reminds me of a story, a project we finished recently for a customer in France. So we built a data lake for them. They had to comply with GDPR, and all they wanted to do was see operationally how their restaurants in Paris were performing compared to Bordeaux, compared to Burgundy. And this was a chain of restaurants, and they literally weren't able to know what was the benchmark across really across the board. So um, this project kind of sounds simple to someone in the data world, but to the executives, it was really life breathing to have just a simple chart. So one of the outputs to this project was some screenshots of charts they had in QuickSight now to say, okay, this is the speed of service in Paris for this product, and this speed of service for the same product in Burgundy. And then they could look down and say, why is this different? And we ended up in their corporate newsletter. They're pretty fired up about it. So I think there is a bit of a PR side to this that we shouldn't ignore. All right, so you got clear, you've architected simply, you've got an executive champion, and Chris, tell us, why do we have a playground here in the middle of this very serious presentation?
You know, by nature, a lot of times when we build these systems, we expect things to be perfect, and others that are around us, maybe expect systems to be perfect. I've found over time that allowing for some dysfunction, a little bit of play, so to speak, is actually super healthy. Not only because it's just the reality of the way some of the things work, but also it allows you to observe behavior with how the data and how the system will be used in the real world, right? I mean, you can go through any amount of testing that you need to feel comfortable with it, but until you see how the analysts are going to use the data, how they're going to combine things together, how they're going to blend the data, you know, you're not going to get a true sense of what your future roadmap for features is, or where some of that unspoken feedback is. And so I would encourage everyone to expect and anticipate and accept a bit of dysfunction with how that data is being used, with other sources being blended in, because it gives you a true sense of, one, that it's being used and it's valuable, but also gives you a sense for where the roadmap for the system should go with future features and data sets that need to come into it.
Yeah, the accepting some mess, knowing that there will be an iterative, experimental approach, I think is essential. It's about managing expectations, and something that I've noticed about data projects that are different from maybe application development projects. When you develop an app, the uncertainty is around how the user will respond to a new feature. But that feature must work. There's a certain amount of bugs that you just don't accept. For a data project, the uncertainty is, what will this data say? And bugs, if that, you can call that a bug, that the data didn't turn out the way we expected, it's not a bug. Data needs to be experimented with and explored and paid attention to over time and iterated on, because we don't want to bring our bias to it. So AWS is an insanely effective playground for people who like data. There's so many tools at your disposal, and again, we just have to stress that the cost of experimentation is low. The only thing you're going to lose is a little bit of time. It's not going to cost much to experiment in the cloud. So please do experiment. Now, let's get real. At a certain point, you want results. So ask yourself, is this working? What I have on this slide is another very basic data infrastructure, where you might be splitting data between S3 and DynamoDB. Again, you want to find out if these users are getting enough data and they're getting it right. I put in DynamoDB here because sometimes the speed of data and the freshness of data is very important. So DynamoDB has single-digit millisecond latency, and in the Kinesis family of products, you can analyze streaming data before it even lands in your data lake. So if data freshness is important, you've got lots of tools at your disposal. And by the way, Kinesis is a fantastic spot for loading in any new data set. So you may contemplate, hey, it seems to be working with this data set. Let's add in another data set. We encourage you to be strategic about that and follow the same set of questions that we said earlier. If I want to add a new data set, what would be the business purpose of it? And how do we expect it to drive decisions in the future? If there's one thing we want to leave you with is you need to press for action with your data. If you'd like to move from a science project or something that just feels like it's only for storage, but you want to make it a strategic asset, you need to press for action. And that comes from the top down. If you can convince an executive to champion your data and you have a really solid business case, start with that, architect simply, and press for action. Chris, any parting thoughts?
No, I think just to double back on the part around the experimentation and kind of embracing some of that dysfunction, I think that is absolutely critical in a modern data environment that has the flexibility that we need to grow and change our business. So I would encourage everyone to embrace that, because the thing about change is if you don't embrace it, you're going to get run over by it. And by embracing some of that experimentation within your environment, you're going to draw closer to your end users, to your partners within the application and the business teams, and ultimately move the business forward overall.
Thanks. This is fantastic. Thank you, everyone, for listening again. I'm Rob Whelan, the head of the data practice at Second Watch, a premier partner headquartered in Seattle, and Chris Garvey, head of product, also based in Seattle. Thank you so much for your time. Now you know how to spot a science project, blow it up and start over, architect for simplicity, and get some action out of your data.